Good to see you again. As you'll know by now, I'm Chris Davis, and this is Just Political Reality, your weekly dose of unbridled truth in a sea of lies. Let's get the begging bowl stuff out of the way nice and early, shall we? If you enjoy the show, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and click like. Don't worry, I'll remind you again at the end. We'll kick off today's show with my reaction to the government's latest cost of living sticking plaster and the windfall tax that must not speak its name. Alexandra Marshall from the Australian Spectator online will be joining me for an extended interview on the Australian elections where Labour have won power for the first time since 2013. Matthew Evans MBE, leader of the opposition on Newport City Council, will be sharing his views on the issues facing the Tories following the local election results in Wales. Last but definitely not least, Benjamin Loughnane, Research Fellow for the Bow Group on Immigration, will be joining me to discuss record levels of inward migration against a backdrop of more vacancies in the economy than we have people registered unemployed. Go figure. Let's get into it. Congratulations to the Conservative Party. Having survived Partygate and moved on, it takes the gun, shoots its left foot, reloads it, shoots its right foot. That now seems to be a daily pastime, along with wondering where its toes have gone. The latest spaffing of £15 billion of taxpayers' money on a mitigation package for a cost of living crisis that it itself helped to create is quite remarkable. More so when a third of the money is going to come from a windfall tax on the oil and gas industries. Yes, the very same oil and gas industries that we are meant to be encouraging to invest their risk into the North Sea to extract more oil and gas, to make us self-reliant on our own oil and gas, to decouple the United Kingdom from the wholesale gas market in particular. But no, maybe I've got it wrong. Maybe VAT on domestic fuel was too difficult, even though it was a key Brexit commitment to remove it. Maybe we should carry on subsidising renewable energy through a renewables levy on electricity bills. Maybe we should not bother storing energy, because why would you? It's not as though it's foreseeable that you could ever have an energy crisis. No, we need to carry on doing things the way we've always done them. No, we don't. We really, really don't. It is time to stop this net zero nonsense that is pervading this government, and it is taking it out of power. After 12 years, the Tories look tired, devoid of ideas, and like a party that just needs to be put out of its misery, as it will be at the next general election. Having secured an 80-seat majority in 2019, it was reasonable to assume that the Tories were well set for the next 10 years thereafter. Not the case. I am increasingly confident, much to my chagrin, that we are facing the worst of all worlds. Not a majority Labour government, but a keep the Tories out coalition through a rainbow of the left. Labour themselves will struggle to win more than 260 seats at the next election. But along with the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens, and all the other non-conservative parties, let's face it, the Tories even managed to upset their natural allies in the Democratic Unionist Party, so they won't work with them again. The likely outcome of the next election is a minority Labour government and a coalition of the Keep the Tories Out parties. What a mess. Not only are we still at the mercy of the wholesale energy markets, and therefore this latest sticking plaster will merely defer the problem, kicking the can further down the road, The lack of strategic vision of this government is quite breathtaking. The energy price cap is a socialist construct. It has led to the insolvency of tens of independent energy providers. It has returned us to a cartel, a big six. And I guarantee you that when wholesale energy prices fall, you will not see the commensurate reduction in your gas and electricity bills. No matter how big a fan you are of Ofgem, if you think about it, you know I'm right. The only people that will really suffer in the medium to long term as a result of this package will be the pension funds. Those who have invested into those pension funds will see a fall in their pension pots as a result of strategic investments in so-called safe gas and oil stocks. The Chancellor has confirmed that he's going to restore the triple lock this year. He's also confirmed that the rate of increase will of course be based on the rate as at the 1st of October, where he expects it to be, and he said as much in Parliament yesterday, around 9%, which is a fair indication that the government, despite the fact they think they are tackling inflation, still expect it to be tackling at around 9% in 5 months' time. Now, Mr. Sunak did point out that he fully expects that next year inflation will be lower, and therefore by the time people actually receive the increase in their pensions, that's the 1st of April 2023, inflation should be lower, so in real terms they'll have a substantial increase. Well, that's all well and good, but what happens between now and the 1st of April? It is time for this government to be conservative. I call for it week after week. Cut income tax. Scrap the proposed 30% hike in corporation tax. Stop taxing the firms that you want to extract the oil and gas that you need to keep the lights on. Stop following short-term, quick fix, stupid measures that only appease briefly the problems that you're trying to address. You will never beat the Labour Party on spending. However much Tories spend, Labour would always spend more. However much the Tories claim to be on the side of ordinary hard-working people, Labour will always say they are much more on their side. This is a problem that the COVID spending has created. It is nothing to do, or little to do, to be fair, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Yes, that is fueling some inflation, but it was baked in. Look at the figures going back to last October when Boris Johnson said he didn't think we were going to have a problem with inflation. Look at the increases. Look at the interest rates up 900% so far this year. Look at the inaction of the Bank of England, the quantitative easing that went on for too long, the failure to raise interest rates early enough. The Tories used to have a reputation for fiscal competence. That reputation is now in the bin. And it will take an awful lot to get it back. Enough is enough. Scrap net zero. Zero-based budgeting for all departments. Start again. Believe it or not, because the Labour Party can't even tell you what the definition of a woman is, the Tories have still got half a chance of turning this around and getting themselves a workable majority at the next election. That is, if they really are conservative. If they even know what conservatism is anymore. Stop trying to appease the Green lobby, learn the lessons from the Australian election, and move on. Move on to conservatism. Turn the party to the right, reoccupy the ground you should be on, put clear blue water between yourselves and the Labour Party before it is too late. And so endeth the lesson. In the battle of the bulldozer and the builder has prevailed. Albo, aka Anthony Albanese, easy for you to say, the son of a single mother on a disability pension, has defeated ScoMo, Scott Morrison, and forced his resignation as leader of the Liberal Party. Despite a slight fall in their share of the vote, Australia has a Labour government for just the fourth time since World War II, after 3 terms of Conservative Liberal national control. I'm joined by Alexandra Marshall from the Spectator Australia Online, who many of you will know is a frequent guest on the Mark Stein Show on GB News. Alexandra's here to talk through some factors that affected the outcome and what it means for Australian politics for the next 3 years. Alexandra, welcome to Just Political Reality.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure, it really is. The former leader of the Liberal Party, Alexandra Downer, has blamed lockdown policy and the abandonment of conservatism as 2 of the factors that affected Scott Morrison's defeat. Would that be broadly correct, or are there other things you think at play here?
Well, he's certainly right that a lot of the true blue ribbon Liberals have abandoned the Liberal Party because they didn't like the tyranny they saw during lockdowns. They didn't like a party that claimed to be for civil liberties and human rights, locking people down and destroying their businesses. Now, let's not forget that the majority of the voters are small business owners or the middle working class. So the lockdowns affected them the worst. So he's totally right with that account. But also we have to take note that there's this ideology taking Australia by storm, which is the climate change. It's almost a cult because we've got an education system which is raising our kids to be devout followers. They take them out of school to protest, and by the time they become voting age, they're voting for what they've been raised on. And their parents are being guilt-tripped into following the kids to the polling booth, basically. And so what we've seen is the moderate Liberals who played into this game, who validated their message, they've lost their seat to those Teals. But the Liberals who didn't do that, who stayed conservative, they are the Liberals that kept their seats. So there's certainly a lesson to be learned there.
Yeah, that sounds like a lesson maybe Boris Johnson needs to learn here. It's interesting. It would appear that we have a similar situation here in Scotland where the education system has been completely hijacked by the left, but it is filtering down through the whole of the United Kingdom, including critical race theory. But it's interesting that the Green agenda, and I can see that the Greens have increased their vote share slightly, but under AV, they don't seem to have won. I think it's a couple of seats to date. I think there's 4 seats that are still counting. But the Green agenda, or the Teals, as I think you refer to them, does seem to have permeated substantially through Australian society.
Well, there's 2. The reason we call them Teals is because there's the Greens that you have. We've all got Greens. They're the same around the world. But then we've got billionaire-backed Teals. And these are the candidates that run a green policy, but for the purposes of changing government policy to build more solar power and wind power. They're backed by billionaires in the renewables industry. So they've marketed themselves as Teal because it's blue, our Liberal blue, plus green, which gives you Teal. That's what we've got over here. I don't think you've quite got them where you are yet, but we do.
Not exactly. We have the Richmond Greens, which is the Goldsmith wing of the Conservative Party, so-called. But yeah, you're not a million miles off the pace. It may be a case of Australia sneezes and the UK catches a cold for once.
Well, the great news about this ideology is that, like every fad, it's a gimmick. And there's no base, there's no ideological truth to it. So when you ask these kids or these parents why they voted Teal or green, they say, oh, to save the planet. And you go, well, how are they going to do that? And they say, oh, we're going to build new solar farms and wind farms. You go, okay, so how does that save the planet when it involves more mining and more carbon than if you didn't? And they don't have a clue. There's nothing behind the ideology. So as their power prices rise and as their cost of living rises and their interest rates go up, this will fall apart. I said it on Twitter. The first time one of these kids can't afford a new iPhone, that will be the end of the green movement.
Yeah, that's interesting because I can see, I mean, Australian inflation's around 5.1% currently, but it does seem to be edging upwards. Do you think there's going to be a significant change in economic policy under Labour? And if so, clearly it's not going to be, shall we say, for lower taxation and reduced public spending. But what direction do you think they will take the economy in other than down?
Have you ever met a pack of socialists that don't like to tax people? I certainly haven't. I mean, you've got the Greens, their policy, if you go to the Greens, apart from decarbonise the military, which is a genuine policy of theirs, They basically got steal from the rich as a policy. So we're going to see that happening. The problem with Australia is, aside from the teal seats, there aren't many rich people left in Australia. The working class and the middle class was wiped out by the COVID lockdowns. They've taken on more debt. They've sold their assets to pay for this 2 years of closures. And so as soon as interest rates start going up, people are in debt. So the interest rates are going to have a severe impact on the psychology of the Australian people. And the government at the moment, the Labor Party, will have to deal with, there's already 3 interest rates on the coming up soon. They're going to have to deal with all the anger for what's going on. And I think that's going to start to undo some of this momentum for the Labor cause. It's certainly changed, but I don't think it's going to be changed for the good. Can I also add that the biggest problem that the Liberals had was actually its leader. We had a weak leader who had no charisma. He had no empathy. At one stage, he actually hired an empathy coach for the bushfires. That is not, it's just not a good sign for the leader of your nation.
I'm trying to keep it, but
connection to the, and that caused him to suffer.
Yeah, it's interesting because I see Peter Dutton has thrown his hat into the ring now for the leadership formally. And he would appear to me, at least, to be a rather different form of, shall we say, more traditional conservative, as opposed to ScoMo, who on paper, a bit like Boris, is was notionally the leader of the Conservative Liberal Party, but in reality was rather more the heir to Blair in Australia. Would that be a fair analysis of the situation?
I don't know how much your audience knows about what happened, but we had Turnbull, who stabbed a successful Liberal leader in Tony Abbott in the back. And when Turnbull got thrown out of power, Dutton, from the other faction, from the Conservative faction, was meant to be the Prime Minister. All of the public support for getting rid of Turnbull was behind Dutton. Yep. And instead, Turnbull managed to turn the party room into electing his preferred successor, which is Scott Morrison, who came from the same moderate faction as Turnbull. And so the public, who wanted a change away from Turnbull and who pushed for the party to change their leader, got the exact leader they didn't want in Scott Morrison. And the next election, he just hung on to power, but only because the Labor guy basically said, we're going to take your utes off you, and all the working class went, sorry, no, maybe not. Right. So he won power almost because by default, he wasn't a loved leader. And Dutton returning is almost restoring what the leadership should have been instead of Scott Morrison. And so we're hoping that a Conservative leader with some energy will help the cause. Unfortunately, he doesn't have as much charisma as we would like. We're hoping he sort of gets a little bit of that going forward, because you do need to be liked by the electorate as well. As horrible as it sounds, you have to be liked if you're going to be elected.
No, likability is huge. I don't have much of that personally, but no, in all seriousness, I think he could obviously borrow from Scott, because, well, he won't be needing it anymore where he's going. It's interesting, actually, you talk about likability, and Labour, it seems to me, have kind of won this election by default. They've won it by turning up.
Yeah, no one likes Labor. I mean, I don't know if it's been reported, but Labor has got the lowest primary vote since 1910. Yep. People didn't like Labor. More people voted Liberal than voted Labor in this election, but because of our preferencing system, which is ridiculous, Labor gets to hold power. So yeah, he's not popular. Albanese went through a full Women's Weekly makeover where he got a new girlfriend, he lost all this weight, they put him in tight pants, so possibly a bit too tight. And that was the best they could do with him, because he's got no personality whatsoever. Basically Morrison lost the election. I don't believe Labor particularly won it.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the things that sort of came through around the fringes was the issue of gender equality in Sydney and Melbourne, where independents have sort of won seats from the Liberal Nationals. What's that all about?
Well, it's quite misleading, because as far as we can tell, there were no seats that came down on the women issue. And the one seat where they played about the women's issues was the seat of Warringah, where we had Catherine Deeves, the Conservative, who was torn to pieces by social media trolls because she dared to say that perhaps we should protect women in sport instead of allowing men to take all the trophies. You know, and when they poll that in the Australian public, amongst both Labor and Liberal voters, only about 2% support the trans rights over women's rights. It's a The issue is not actually in favour of the minority groups. Most people want women's rights to supersede them. Those electorates were overcome by the climate narrative. It was very much a virtue-driven election that was based on climate guilt. Yeah. And if you ask anybody in Warringah or Wentworth or Kooyong why they voted Teal, it wasn't to do with women because they were girls. It was because they were saving the planet. That was their vote. So we could overplay that far too much.
So the liberal media in both Australia and the United Kingdom, who are never shy of picking up on it, and this was virtually the first story on the mainstream media, which is unusual, shall we say, for an Australian election, certainly when the Liberal Nationals win power. It might be about the 6th item on about page 12 of a newspaper, and it might just about make the evening news as an also-ran afterthought. But as soon as it was clear that Labour were going to win, it became massive headline news. And it's almost as though they are looking for anything that sort of looks and smells Labour-ish to celebrate in the United Kingdom, which I found quite interesting, to say the least. You mentioned earlier on about the pandemic response and lockdowns and all of that kind of stuff, and really the ruination of small business in Australia as a result of that. I mean, how much, given that Labour have now got 3 years in office, clearly inflation is going to be problematic, the economy is going to struggle, interest rates are going to have to go up. How realistic do you think it will be for sort of the Conservatives to return to power in 3 years' time? Is it key that they get the right leader, or is it more a case of, a bit like Labour this time around, they could win by default because people tend to look at recency and blame the government that's incumbent for things as they really start to go sour?
Well, let me first say that the reason they lost on climate wasn't because the Teals and the Greens were right. It's because the Liberal Party didn't fight the issue at all. They basically validated the claims of the climate apocalypse people by saying, if you go to a website of one of the people, the Liberals in Warringah, they actually had climate change now as their narrative. They were almost identical to the Greens. So they gave that narrative validity instead of fighting it. So there was no counter narrative at all coming out of Conservative politics. So they didn't lose a fight, they didn't actually make a fight. The same is true on the lockdowns. So we had a Liberal Party that made no attempt whatsoever to preserve or protect the rights of citizens. They sat there and day in, day out, literally in press conference every day for 2 years, told Australian people that if you don't get vaccinated, you are a terrible person, you're killing people. Our Liberal Party did that. And they allowed the public to demonise and actively hate people who made a choice about their body. And that narrative has never been corrected by a single Conservative, except for maybe Alex Antic and Matt Canavan, a couple of fringe, like we call them fringe because the Liberal Party don't like them, but they are the true Conservatives left in the party. Everyone else allowed hatred to brew inside our community. And because of that, those voters abandoned the Liberal Party and went to the Freedom Parties. No kidding, right? So if the Liberal Party want to fix that, they have to actually step up and correct that narrative, put out the facts that they know now are true, that these people didn't harm anybody. They didn't do the wrong thing. They're allowed to have their rights. They have to correct this story before the Liberal Party will get anywhere, because those voters are never coming back to a party that locked them up or treated, like I myself am unvaccinated, and I was treated like I was less than human by people I've known my whole life. And that came directly from the government. And that can't be allowed to happen in the future.
So the only way to tackle that lemming mentality then is actually hands up, we got it wrong, we're sorry. It's an underrated word, actually. It's overused in some quarters, but sometimes you just got to put your hands up and say, we got it wrong.
Yeah, I don't even need the apology. What the Liberal Party has to do is they have to outlaw discrimination in businesses, because right now people cannot work in their jobs because businesses are allowed to continue discriminating. They put COVID safe up the top of their banners, and they sack all their unvaccinated staff. There's some terrible story of these single mums who work at Woolworths and Coles who were sacked a couple of weeks ago, even after everything that we know. That has to end. And if the Liberal Party want to regain their base, they should enforce an equal landscape, which is what they keep claiming they believe in. Restore normality to the Australian population, some security to business, promise never to do that again. And then they will have the confidence of the general population, and the old Menzies, forgotten people will join them again. But not until they fix that problem that they caused, and they really did cause it themselves.
Yeah, this is shooting the loading the gun, shooting left foot, reload gun, shoot right foot, and repeat every day, and wonder why your toes don't grow back. I mean, it's insanity. I mean, we got as far over here as taking people in the health service all the way to the line, and then right at the end decided, no, we better not get rid of 60,000 people. There's already 90,000 vacancies in the health service. We actually need people, to at least open the doors every morning. It's insane.
They just sacked ours. They just sacked ours. They didn't bother. They just got rid of them. They didn't care. And now they're still complaining about shortages in education and the hospital industry, going, well, stop sacking people if that's what you're worried about. Literally just stop. They'll give you your readers one example of the most outrageous thing they did. Shopping centres, supermarkets, where they stacked shelves. They fired all the young people, and then they asked all the aged pensioners and disability pensioners to come in and work the shelves because they couldn't get enough of the other people back in. That is the level of ridiculously we're operating in Australia.
That really is supporting yourself in retirement. I mean, this is almost Ardern-esque. I mean, is this a situation where the little guy has sneezed, or in the case of Ardern, is she a guy? No, let's not go there. But is this a case of New Zealand has sneezed and Australia's caught the cold? I mean, along with Trudeau, it seems to me from what you're saying that Morrison is up there with the most lockdown absurdities that have been over the last 2 years.
Well, what Morrison did, which I found particularly appalling, is instead of taking national leadership on the pandemic, which was his job and is laid out as his job with all of our health acts, he decided to create national cabinet, which was later discovered to not be a real cabinet, in order to allow the premiers of our states to make their own decisions. And that way, Morrison did not have to take any leadership or responsibility for what happened in the pandemic. Gotcha. And that alone has come back to bite him, because he doesn't get any of the benefits of the pandemic, but he does get all the blame, and he shouldered all the cost. It was a mistake, and it was a failure of leadership. And that is one of the reasons that he lost. That's
insane. So the leader of the country decided, no, not for me. I'm going to devolve this to WA, to New South Wales, regional governors. And, if it all goes well, that's great. And if it all goes badly, that's great too. That's insane. That's not leadership. That's ridiculous.
And he praised, I don't know if you guys saw Mark McGowan, the leader of Western Australia, who was basically crowned lockdown king. He praised him for his approach to the pandemic. He praised Daniel Andrews after he shot protesters, rallied around the Freedom Monument in Melbourne. Not a good look for a prime minister to be doing that. No. With his national cabinet, it turned out that because it wasn't a real cabinet, it wasn't allowed to use the secrecy laws. And so when that was ruled in court, instead of honouring that and releasing the advice of National Cabinet, he just changed the law, the constitution, not constitution, the act, to allow him to keep everything secret that was discussed in National Cabinet. Now, that is not good behaviour for a Conservative Prime Minister.
I suppose it's probably time to look to the future, because the past sounds absolutely horrific and grim. I mean, this is dystopian central. How hopeful are you that the Liberal Nationals will be an effective opposition over the next 3 years and be able to return the country to Conservative control in 2025?
Two things worry me. The first is this fear-mongering and constant propaganda from the pandemic. It sits in society. Once you convince people to hate other people in a society, that takes a long time to go away. And without leadership saying that that's wrong and you shouldn't do it, it stays there. So I'm worried that these people who enjoy lockdowns, who like ordering their fellow citizens around it, who actively want to punish people who dissented from the narrative, that's going to stay in the Australian psyche and continue to vote for more lockdowns and more left-wing politics unless the Liberals come and contradict that strongly, because that's there and that is real. The other thing that worries me is I'm watching online and in print the Liberals and other freedom parties learn exactly the wrong lesson from this election. Freedom parties actually did pick up their votes, and they were the least harmed from the fallout of this thing. And what I'm seeing is, we might as well just let this climate change thing go. No, we're about to watch the repercussions of climate change psychosis coming into reality as far as economics is concerned. And in 3 years, people are going to be looking for answers as to why none of this worked. And so the best thing you can do is to fight tooth and nail to destroy the image of virtue, to show what these technologies really do, and to dismantle that ideology so that when it comes to election, you have a platform to fight back on. And that is not what I'm seeing. I'm seeing people go, you should move more to the left, like the Victorian Liberals or the Western Australian Liberals, of which there is no party in either of those two states. They're basically gone. So they're taking terrible advice. And I just hope they look to their betters in history and look at particularly English history about how you fight against these terrible collectivist movements and how you win.
It sounds to me as though the Liberals have got their campaign manager for 2025 right there. Very quickly, because I'm mindful of time, especially as it is the evening where you are, and I know you've probably got people to see and places to go. So 2 more questions very quickly. There was a big thing made of Albanese saying he's not woke during the election campaign. I'm not too sure about that. What's your views, very briefly?
It's possible that Albanese doesn't know what woke means. That's definitely a possibility. He's kind of out of touch, if we're going to be polite about it. But he certainly supports woke policies. So what happened in that comment is that was all about, can you define a woman? And that was after all these ridiculous films came on the internet of our chief health officers not being able to define a woman in the Senate hearings, which is just ridiculous. And so someone sensible from the Labor press corps was like, just say that a woman is a biological thing and you'll be fine. And that's where the he's not woke thing came from. All of his other policies are totally woke, including his policies surrounding females. They're all for gender quotas above merit and, trans rights above women's rights and, leftist climate eco-fascism above reality. They're all for it all. So he is woke as far as his policies, but yeah, he might not know what it means.
Adult human female, it's a wonderful term, but just don't ask Ricky Gervais. And finally, in terms of where you see Australia now, I mean, you've highlighted there that there is now an endemic problem here with people who are vaccinated and people who are unvaccinated, and it's almost become very polarizing, almost to the point of sort of in a post-Trump America. How do you see that evolving? I mean, surely from the point of view of just plain economics and actually moral right and wrong, you cannot continue to discriminate against people based on their vaccine status. I'm not sure this is a political issue. I think it's more of a social issue within Australia. How easy do you think it's going to be to repair those bridges just on a societal level, within families? This has caused family breakdowns, as I understand it. Do you see this being something that can be relatively easily remedied, or do you think this is a stain that could hang on for 10 or 20 years?
No, I lost my best friend of 30 years. She didn't even say goodbye, just blocked on Facebook when she found out I wasn't vaccinated. This is the kind of thing that you get when it's damage that's been done to society from the top down. So most of Australia was not immediately radicalized into this. If you look at places like New South Wales, where I live, people weren't even obeying mask rules. We had no interest in pandemic craziness at all. And they had to, I think it was only about 30% of New South Wales was vaccinated, and they couldn't get us to go and get vaccinated. So they locked us in our homes, shut all of our businesses and said, you can only come out if you get vaccinated. And that's how they got our vaccination levels up to 95%. It wasn't exactly a choice. And that's manipulation of the social fabric from the top. And the only way to fix that is to go from the top back down again. And for the leaders on both sides, although it's doubtful whether Labor will actually do it, to correct what they said. And if they do the same thing again, but with correcting the narrative, then they will eventually weed out that ideology, because I don't believe in my heart that Australians want to hate each other. I think they did that through fear and conditioning. And so that could be undone, but it has to be done quickly. You can't let that sit there for a decade. Or the next time you have a pandemic, the next time a flu season rocks around, this is going to be built on and built on and built on. And that's what worries me. So yes, I think we can fix it, but it's going to take leadership, and it's going to take at least the Conservative Party to come out and take some responsibility and act like an adult in the room and stop pandering to international panic made by internet and bureaucracies. One last thing, sorry.
No.
The reason that we saw this happen And why they haven't corrected the narrative is because COVID gave them a lot of power. We had just last week, South Australia, the newly elected premier there, he has codified and made permanent the emergency powers into the Health Act. Western Australia's done the same thing. I mean, Victoria was put on the Human Rights Watch as basically a literal dictatorship around COVID. They don't want to lose the power they had in the pandemic, even though reports coming out saying that they did more harm than good and it would have been better off if they had no power at all. So they don't want to say they were wrong. They certainly don't want to give any credence to the idea that they don't need these powers. And so it's only if the politicians can step back and do what's right for the country instead of themselves that the people of Australia will see some of their liberties returned and a normal state of being put back on the agenda.
Whatever happened to Conservatives govern and Socialists rule? I mean, that is what you're describing there is some third world tin pot military dictatorship, and yet it's happening in Australia, which to me is just bizarre. Alexandra, I'm so grateful to you for coming on and giving so freely of your time. I'm sure that lots of people are going to want to hear what you have to say in an extended interview, because I know with someone like Mark, you normally get sort of 10, 15 minutes or so. And I appreciate we have substantially overrun. So thank you so much for coming on today. And hopefully we can do this again at some stage in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm delighted to be joined next by Matthew Evans MBE, who is the leader of the Conservative Party on Newport City Council. Matthew, good morning and thanks for taking the time to join me.
Good morning, Chris.
Matthew, you were, until the local election results a couple of 3 weeks ago, the leader of the council, and sadly things have sort of turned the other way, and now the Tories don't control any councils in Wales. What exactly do you think went wrong?
Well, actually, I need to correct you there. I was leader of the council between 2008 and 2012. First elected in 1999, where I took a seat from Labour. Essentially, there was a coalition for 4 years between us and the Lib Dems. I've retained my position as leader of the opposition. So I've been leader of the opposition and leading my group for about 18 years now. But it was 2012 where we lost out to Labour.
Thank you for correcting me. So good start there.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, just looking across Wales, I mean, the Tories clearly lost quite a number of councillors. Yeah. Just widely, what do you think was the root cause of that? Was it really Westminster politics, or is there something that's sort of gone wrong in Wales that has moved people further and further towards Mark Drakeford and the Labour Party?
That's interesting. I mean, if I look at my sort of neighbouring authority of Monmouth, where we did control the council, only one in Wales, I think it's fair to say that the leader of the council there, or the former leader, took it was a fairly scathing of the UK government, took very much, like I'd say, more Cameron approach. They had 50 all-women shortlists, and yet we still lost control of the council. In neighbouring Torvine, we lost all our councillors. In Cardiff, we went down from 20 to 10, so they halved. In Bridgend, 11 to 1. There's inevitably the Westminster factor, but I don't think it's the only one. And I can only really talk about all the campaigning I've done across Newport. The one thing I can't give the answer to, and I've never understood, is the success of Mark Drakeford. Where I guess some of the Conservative, in inverted commas, supporters quite liked his approach of staying in lockdown for longer and feeling safer. But I guess turnout was very poor. In my own ward, it went down by about 3%. Overall, across the city, the turnout was about 33%. So I think apathy was obviously the biggest winner.
Sure.
And it's difficult to pinpoint, but definitely I wouldn't say it was the only factor about UK politics. We concentrated very much on local issues, where Labour have been in charge for 43 out of the last 50 years. But the one thing I will say is that they've got far bigger machinery and organisation and resources. Across the city, they've got both the MPs, both the members of the Senate, and it's pretty much always been the same. And so when you talked about the Red Wall, South Wales was the last area where it hasn't really cracked.
No, indeed. I mean, the Drakeford factor for me is not necessarily in a good way, but it is a phenomenon because, I mean, the last of the restrictions in Wales, I think I'm right in saying, are only literally just being lifted now.
Yeah, today.
In relation to COVID.
Yeah.
And I find it quite remarkable that, you know, Sturgeon and Drakeford, who went harder and deeper, if you like, even than what I considered draconian restrictions in England, don't seem to have suffered at all for that, which compared with, you know, some of the other leaders worldwide, you look at the Australian elections, what's happened down with Scott Morrison, for example, where there's been a bit of a backlash against that as well as other issues, do seem to have suffered. But you're quite right, the Labour position in Wales still seems relatively rock solid. And it strikes me, I don't want to dwell too much on Westminster politics today. I'm much more interested in talking about Wales. But I'd be interested to get your take on the vulnerability of the remaining Welsh Tory MPs in Wales, because it seems to me that if the latest opinion polling is right, that quite a number of those, in fact, possibly all of them, may well lose their seats at the next election.
Well, I'd hate to make predictions. I mean, bearing in mind that in the 2019 elections, I stood in Newport West, got 18,000 votes under the Prime Minister, and Labour got 18,900. There is a degree of volatility, and I know there were a lot of our supporters who stayed away. But if it comes to a general election, the choice between ourselves and, well, myself and Sir Keir, who's not incredibly popular, Mark Drakeford will be standing down as First Minister. So I think there's going to be rocky times ahead for Labour. But I guess it's one of those conundrums that actually, as far as Newport goes, there were an independent party who took 4 seats off Labour in one area, and another independent party who held on to their 3 seats in what should have been a rock solid Labour seat. So there are opportunities where people will take a look. We had our first Green councillor in Newport ever, in an area which I would never have predicted, but they clearly ran an effective campaign in this particular area of the city. Ironically, an area where I used to get many complaints about Labour stopping the M4 Reef Road, and yet they went for a green candidate. Lib Dems were supposed to do well. They lost one of their 2 seats, even though they put up a strong fight in 3 areas. They actually did very poorly in the city. So it's a very mixed picture, and I find it really difficult. I mean, I stood in 12 elections now to try and get the understanding of why Labour seem to retain their dominance.
Well, I mean, one of the things, and you alluded to it earlier on, admittedly not in your own authority, is this idea of all women shortlists and, you know, improving diversity. You will never outflank, in my opinion anyway, the left when it comes to virtue signalling and equality. And surely meritocracy has to trump that, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You know, I mean, we actually got a higher, quite a significant number of ethnic minority candidates, but they were also all chosen by their merits. We've been vigorously opposed to all women shortlists, and we actually tried our best to try and find as many, you know, good female candidates, which is important. But no, we totally ruled that out because we think it's wrong, and everybody should stand on their own merits. And ultimately, you've got pretty much 50% of the population who have to represent the other 50% of the population. If you don't do a good job, the voters will vote you out. So no, I'm not keen on all women shortlists.
No, it's a zero-sum game, isn't it? It's not difficult, but if you serve your constituents well, I wouldn't say completely regardless of national politics, because clearly, as you say, whether they should or not, they do play a role in local elections. But broadly speaking, a good, strong constituency councillor, generally speaking, can to a great extent transcend that. And your own success is testament to that, really. I mean, give me a feel for, it's clearly difficult being a Conservative in vast parts of Wales. But
Yeah.
where, in terms of providing effective opposition, are there enough Conservative councillors now, do you think, to do that across Wales? And then particularly in your own council, how easy do you find it to provide relatively effective opposition to a Labour-led administration?
Well, I've been here before. I think in 2004, I think there were five of us and 40 Labour. Now there's 7 of us and 35 Labour.
Right.
It is tough, but I guess factually we're still the main official opposition, and there are always opportunities, not just in political meetings, but you know, as leaders of opposition, I always make sure I attend the Merchant Navy Memorial Service, Remembrance Day next week as a Platinum Jubilee, you know, tree. So I'll do my best to be involved in the community, and try and represent and support some of the other parties, because ultimately there will be times where I'll actually support the council itself, because I'm pragmatic, and just saying you're going to oppose everything like Keir Starmer does, oh, we would have done that earlier, we would have done that later, we would have done that, isn't effective politics as far as I'm concerned. So I think we need to take a pragmatic approach. For instance, if the city's putting in a bid for the Freeport status, then we will support that, because it's in the best interest of the city. So I've been around a long time, and will support and will oppose as necessary. But opposing everything doesn't get you anywhere, because people will just say what he's doing is moaning without any practical solutions. So it'll be a thought process.
I agree with that. I think cross-party collaboration actually is highly understated, both nationally and locally. And you're right, there is no point in opposing for the sake of opposing. You've used the example of Starmer. I think you could use the example of Sturgeon and various others who just on dogmatic grounds will oppose everything, say, that the Tories want to do just because it's the Tories. That doesn't make for good politics. It actually doesn't make, as you say, it's a completely unpragmatic way of getting business done. So, I mean, would it be fair to say that, okay, it's a Labour-controlled council, they've got a substantial majority, but do you still feel that in terms of that spirit of collaboration, that not only are you able to support them where you think it's appropriate, but that also that you would have the ear of the senior leadership team within the Labour group to actually potentially adopt a Conservative proposal that again could have broad party consensus support?
Yeah, I certainly hope so, and that's the approach I've taken, and it's the only effective way when you're talking about significant numbers. If it was unhung between 1 or 2 people, then that might be a slightly different thing. But we've got to be realistic, and we've got to recognise that ultimately, despite everybody moaning and I talk to, Labour have got a massive majority in the city, and we have to respect the views of the voters.
Yes.
Okay, 67% didn't bother voting, but ultimately, don't complain about that. You had the opportunity. So, yeah, pragmatic approach is important.
You alluded to your own general election result where you fell just 900 short of defeating the Labour candidate.
Yeah.
How much do you think the next general election, which looks as though it's going to be 23, if not 24, well, it has to be 24 because it'll be 5 years, is likely to be influenced now that Brexit is perceived to be done? And we can argue the semantics of whether or not it is, certainly if you look at the Northern Ireland situation, and the repealing of red tape. But how much of a factor do you think that the fact that Brexit theoretically has now been delivered will weigh against the Conservatives?
I mean, we always say a week's a long time in politics, but a couple of years, it's impossible to predict. At the moment, clearly the cost of living crisis is affecting everybody, and I'm glad to see the Chancellor has finally acted and put some significant finances into that. I wish he'd done it before the election rather than after it. But no, it is difficult to say. The public are far more volatile. I mean, it used to be that you know, solid Labour, wherever they are. Brexit, there was clearly a defining split from people who had always voted Labour. But it's happened before. I mean, there have occasions where Labour have given their own government a kick in the teeth by voting for Plaid Cymru on some occasions, or voting for independence and then going back to Labour. And that's happened in a number of, particularly in sort of North Gwent, sort of Blaenau and Gwent, where they had the first independent member of the Welsh Parliament, and then they had an independent council. Now Labour are taking control of it again. So I think they do pick and choose, but they're not afraid to turn around and say, right, we're going to give you a reminder that you don't take us for granted, and then they'll give them another chance again. So as far as Conservative voters go, it's interesting that some of what I'd call some of the council estates across the city, where you have a lot of people who bought their own council homes, who work as mechanics or engineers or run small business. The Conservative vote held up well, and even where we weren't contesting seriously, we came quite a very credible second. In other parts of the city, we lost votes because you have a different type of a voter appeal, I guess. So to some people, the PM's issues were very important. In other parts of the city, they weren't. So politics is changing, and I guess we need to evolve and listen and talk to people and just see what the real concerns or issues are moving forward.
Yeah, you've neatly segued into where I was going to come from next, which is I'll come on to Plaid Cymru, which I think is more of an issue away from the particular area of Wales that you're in, perhaps.
Yeah.
But in terms of the broad church consensus support for the Conservative Party, clearly, something like the 2019 general election was very polarising, really, around Brexit, and it did move people away, not just in Wales, but from their perhaps traditional voting habits to quote unquote get Brexit done.
Yeah.
But in terms of yes, local elections are often a protest vote, and clearly, you've said it yourself, with the number of years out the last 50 years that Labour have been in power, they do have a rock solid local base. You alluded earlier on, though, to something around the Labour Party machine in Wales, which seems akin to what the Lib Dems have in national by-elections, which is a number of more boots on the ground and a very effective campaign force, not just with leafleting, but with their whole presence there. Is it fair to say that there is by relative terms, a lack of Conservatives on the ground that are willing to go out, knock doors, hand out leaflets and campaign at election time?
Well, again, I can only speak about the Newport experience.
Yeah, of course.
Clearly, they had virtually 3 times as many councillors as us before. Yeah. With the MPs and having the members of the Welsh Parliament, they do tend to, how should I put it, deal with lots of constituency issues. People join the party. I mean, the local Labour Party where I represent is a big, strong organisation. Some would argue it's full of champagne socialists, because in the leafy suburbs, people assume, well, they're going to vote Conservative. Well, actually, there were Labour posters in my area, in the leafy suburbs, where people tend to have the background of their university lecturers, teachers, and we have a big percentage of people who work in the public sector. We have a statistics office, a patent office, people working for the Welsh government, the council, and those are other factors which I think tend to lend their support or give their support to a strong public sector rather than private sector.
And how joined up would you say, take for example the Senate and then drilling down into local councillors, how joined up would you say the Conservative Party is in Wales?
We have a very good relationship with the members of the Welsh Parliament, the Conservative group down there. We have prior to the election, we always used to have a monthly meeting for all members, and we'd have Andrew R.T. Davis coming down. We'd have the local government people coming down. We have a strong relationship with the 2 local MMSs for the regional Conservatives, Natasha Ashgar and Laura Ann Jones. So we have, but I guess that's up to me to keep inviting them, or for them to keep inviting. So we do have a strong working relationship with them. We do have input, and I think that's good.
That sounds encouraging, to say the least. Just looking at the outlook for things going for, well, I suppose, the next sort of 2 to 3 years. What do you think needs to happen in terms of Westminster? You've alluded already to last week's package from Rishi Sunak, and I think, as you quite rightly say, it would have been helpful if that had happened maybe a couple of weeks before the local elections, rather than a couple of weeks afterwards, because it was inevitable that something more had to be done. Whether or not I agree with how it was done and the windfall tax and everything else is irrelevant. Something needed to happen, and it's good that it has. But what else in terms of what's your views at the moment nationally on the direction of travel of the Conservative Party? Because it does seem, and watching Sunak last week in the House of Commons, he was almost triumphalist around outspending the Labour Party in terms of the redistribution of monies going back to individual households. I mean, do you see nationally the Conservative Party is parking its tanks increasingly on a centre-left lawn in a battle I don't think it can ever win? Are you minded that perhaps it needs to move back to the right and put some clear blue water between it and Labour? Or do you think, no, they're doing a good job, and in terms of Welsh conservatism, it's not unduly damaging you?
I think the key thing going forward for the next general election is going to be how the economy is performing. And ultimately, I want to see lower taxes. I want to see tougher action from the police. I want to see immigration controlled. And those, to me, are the key factors. Ultimately, if people are, how shall I put it? I can remember somebody turning around to me many years ago when Tony Blair was in charge, and he said, "I'm doing all right, Jack, so I'm quite happy to vote Labour," because he was doing well. And I think that's the critical factor. In 2 years' time, if we've got inflation under control, the economy is doing well, then that will outplay any other factor, because you can say that the economy is strong and moving forward. And with a strong economy, then of course you can spend more money on the police and things like that. So I think that's going to be the number one factor for people. And if we see low unemployment levels, that's also going to be important.
You touched on immigration there. I mean, clearly, having looked at the Home Office figures last week, we now have a record level of inward migration. How big an impact is there for Wales in that respect, and in particular in your area? Is that something that you feel appreciably, particularly in terms of pressure on housing, or is it not really much of an issue for you?
Well, it is an issue, and ironically, something I haven't mentioned is in Wales, foreign nationals and 16-year-olds were allowed to vote.
Indeed.
And I don't know how much impact that potentially had across there. I think, controlled immigration, and I welcome controlled immigration. There has been some racial tension, and that tends to be with the more established ethnic minority communities and some of the newer ones coming in to the area. But I guess it's a question of who you talk to. I haven't had, with the local election, I was talking about local issues, talking about the potholes, talking about the fly tipping, talking about the rubbish. So we weren't asking people of how much an issue that was, because we wanted to keep it on local things. So I guess when it comes to the next general election, then we will be changing tack and asking how much an issue it is for people.
Two more questions, if I may.
Yeah.
In terms of devolution, how successful do you think it's been for Wales?
I'm disappointed, because even though I voted against it, I respected the views of a small minority of people from it. And I guess I'm disappointed because it was supposed to devolve powers down. But all I found from a council perspective is we've had more and more burdens put on us by the Welsh government, Welsh Parliament. So, had they said, right, we're going to free up councils to do more, then perhaps it'd been a different story. But all I keep hearing and seeing is impositions being opposed from the Welsh Labour government, and moving forward, they're going to get more and more draconian. We've got 50-mile-an-hour speed limit on the motorway, 20-mile-an-hour zones on main roads, which are being imposed without any consultation with local councillors. We're told we have to do an annual report by the Welsh government. Well, what's it got to do with them? So there's an increasing, ban on smoking in public places, all the sort of things that they like to control. So I'm more disappointed the fact that we've had 23 years of Labour than the devolution process itself.
Yeah, it doesn't sound overly libertarian, does it?
No.
I mean, nationally, I think there is appreciable waste in central government to the point where, to my mind, I think there should be zero-based budgeting going forward to try and remove some of that waste, not just in terms of ongoing revenue spending, but also capital projects. But in terms of Wales, how big an issue do you think that there is in terms of waste, both in the Senate and more widely across councils that are largely Labour controlled?
Well, it is a massive issue, and of course, every time on social media or Twitter, people will say, "Oh, well, in England, it's 5 times more, it's worse," and so and so. But I guess people forget that the population of the UK is what, 60 odd million. Wales it's about 3.5 million. The M4 Relief Road is a classic example of where it was a Labour Party policy till just after the by-election I stood in, funnily enough, when they took it off the table. They spent £153 million, and they were consulting about this when I first became a councillor in 1999. So there we are, £150 million squandered. The end result is nothing. Nothing to show from death by consultation, and £150 million on that one particular project. So it's pretty much highlights what the wastage and the bureaucracy which seems to be part of the job.
But it enriched the number of consultants, so that's all okay, I guess, for them.
Yeah.
Final question. My belief is that Wales wishes to, and I certainly wish it to, remain an integral part of the United Kingdom. There clearly at the moment is no significant support for Welsh independence. Is there anything that you see on the ground that suggests that the needle is moving more towards the likes of Plaid Cymru and their position? Or am I about right that it is still broadly probably 35-65 in favour of maintaining Wales within the United Kingdom?
And probably more than that, to be honest. I mean, Plaid Cymru have been incredibly vocal on Twitter. I have to, every day I look at my Twitter feed, and even a comment about the monarchy last night seems to get them all up in arms and angry. They are not the party of Wales. In Newport, they only managed to field 6 candidates, I think, across the 51. They didn't field any candidates in Monmouthshire, in the neighbouring thing. So they're not party of Wales. They're not even the second party in Wales at the moment. They're a pretty poor third behind the Welsh Conservatives. Yes, they've got their power base in North Wales, but even the Valley politics, where they will sometimes switch to Plaid and then back to Labour, I don't think there's seriously a real appetite for independence. It's a trendy thing to say at the moment. And yes, there are business people and people who think that's the way forward. But I'm hoping that it'd be a long, long time before we have a referendum on that.
Well, in my admittedly relatively limited experience, in my other life, I do have a number of clients in Wales, but I don't know one that supports the notion of independence, regardless of their day-to-day political allegiance. Matthew, thank you ever so much for joining me today. I hope we can stay in touch and do this again from time to time. It's really good to take the heartbeat of Wales, because I often think that most of the political coverage focuses so much on Westminster and London and England, and actually ignores the importance of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which to my mind, you'll probably tell from the surname, I think I'm either an 8th or a 16th, and I really should know that Welsh, is important to me, especially as somebody who believes in the sanctity of the United Kingdom. Thank you ever so much for joining me today, Matthew. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure, Chris.
That was Matthew Evans MBE, who is the leader of the opposition Conservative Party on Newport City Council. Next, I'm delighted to introduce Benjamin Loughnane. Benjamin is Research Fellow for Immigration at the Bow Group. Benjamin, thank you very much for joining the show.
How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, and I hope likewise. Benjamin, the latest inward migration figures make for pretty grim reading. It's interesting that the Home Office have chosen at this stage not to publish the number of people who have actually left the United Kingdom. But could you just put some light and shade around this for me and tell me that a record level of people coming into the country is not the disaster for potentially public services and yet more taxpayers' money than I think it is?
Well, you know, on the one hand, you're right to think that that's correct. On the other hand, there is the natural consequence of 2 years of a freeze on migration. So where we've seen such a stark reduction due to lockdown and its associated maladies, we are seeing a resurgence now 2 years down the line. A lot of people, for example, who had plans to come to the UK, who held off on coming to the UK because of what was going on, will have taken the opportunity now, especially given the fact that we're now the freest country probably in the world. We opened up so much more quickly than any other country. So over the past year, there are a number of countries in the world where you were still forced to wear masks, even outside on the street, and that sort of ridiculous nonsense. And so I can see why a lot of people will have gone, do you know what, I'm going to go to the UK. I was planning to go anyway. Now's the perfect time to do it. So I do think that's an aspect of it. We may therefore see a reduction next year as that sort of catch up from the past couple of years of a slower rate dissipates somewhat. However, what we need to be wary of is that next year, if we do see a lowering in the rate back to sort of closer to the levels we saw in 2019, 2018, we don't allow the Home Office to turn around and say, look, we've reduced immigration. Look, we're cutting it. We're doing what you want. Because ultimately, they're not doing anything. It's just natural circumstances. In a way, the best policy for migration we had was lockdown. But of course, that's bad for a number of other reasons. And all it ever really did was hold off the wave rather than prevent it from coming. So yeah, we do have a higher number of entrants to the UK. However, I don't think that's necessarily the new normal. I don't think that's precedential, nor do I think that next year we will see the exact same, 1 million entrants as we did this year.
So you think it's more of a statistical lag that will even itself out than necessarily a surge in immigration simply because the government is being too lax in giving out visas?
I think when you look at the 10-year figures, they'll be pretty consistent with the 10 years before with a slight rise. I don't think there'll be a huge increase. The main problem at the moment is the increase in South Indian entrants. So the type of migration has changed. So we're seeing a vast number of people coming from places like India rather than from Europe, where they would previously have come from. But that's really a change in type rather than anything else. Obviously it has a different implication than something like European migration does. However, ultimately, when it comes down to statistical issues, things like public services, strain on the NHS, and certainly strain on housing, which is a huge aspect of immigration, which is completely ignored and denied by the usual suspects. But the downward pressure on the housing market, which is introduced by mass migration, is one of the reasons why so many young people are struggling to be able to get on the property ladder nowadays. But no, something like, you know, the way that migration has changed over the past few years is primarily where it's coming from. Now, obviously, that opens up a whole host of other questions. But in terms of pressure on services, you know, schools, etc., shops, food supply, etc., it's much the same.
So in terms of housing, then, I mean, that has a direct effect on town planning. And it sounds to me from what you're saying, and this is certainly anecdotally what I'm seeing and hearing, is that there's not enough consideration of the need for housing to not just deal with the local and the indigenous population, but to actually deal with the incoming immigrant population. Hence, you get a situation in somewhere like Linton on Ouse, where it looks to me as though, in a very hurried way, a village of 700 people has now got 1,500, mainly young men, now mixing, or will be mixing freely with the villagers in the coming days.
Yeah, that's one particular very bad example of Home Office policy and how they're distributing these people. To take a number of people, which is greater than the village, by 2 to 1, is a disastrous policy decision. I don't know how it's been allowed to go through. I don't know how it hasn't been reversed since it's become public knowledge. You're almost forgiven for believing it might be deliberate, but because what else could it be? How could you make such a disastrous policy decision unless it was a social experiment to see what happens if you outnumber a village 2 to 1?
I would agree with you there. It almost feels personal against Kevin Hollinrake, actually, who appears to be, in terms of the constituency that elected him, very popular within his constituency and with the constituents, to the point where I think he's potentially taken this all the way to judicial review. But it's almost as though he's really upset somebody in the Home Office. On that subject, I mean, my own view of the Home Office, out of all the government departments, and I think there is huge waste in government and the potential to cut billions of pounds of wasteful spending. But the Home Office, in terms of being fit for purpose, what's your take on that in relation to immigration? Because to me, it seems to be wholly politicised.
Yeah, I've long said that the Home Office should be broken down into a number of other departments.
Yeah.
Some things should fall entirely under number 10. I think that something like immigration should be the responsibility of the Prime Minister, not farmed out to a department in a way that it is at the moment. Yes, you might have a department to deal with it separate, so an entire department for immigration would probably be justified because it's such a huge issue which has such a large impact. And if you have departments like DEFRA, and that sort of stuff, then you should really have something for immigration. Especially at the moment, the Home Office is policing, immigration, terrorism, counter blah 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 blah. It's all of these areas fall under one bracket, and is that really something that one cabinet minister should be responsible for? These are a number of huge issues which are massively important, and if you could subdivide it down somewhat so that you have a few people handling each individual issue, I think that would do a lot of good. But even then, you've got to deal with the civil service. So the civil service is the main problem. A lot of civil servants are ideologically attached to mass immigration as a policy. So even if you have a Secretary of State for immigration who is against mass immigration, the civil service will frustrate their efforts to do anything about it. So you've got to deal with the civil service as well. So there are a number of structural issues. From the top level, it's the fact that the department is too big to function as a proper department, and from the bottom level, you've got the civil service who will very conveniently do their jobs very badly when they're asked to do something about the current rate. So those are the issues.
All on the taxpayer's dollar. You touched earlier on South Asia and Indian and Pakistani migration back to the UK, and I found it quite convenient, shall we say, that whilst the House of Commons was debating whether or not to refer Boris to the Standards Committee, he was actually in South Asia seeing Narendra Modi, talking about effectively rolling out the red carpet to hundreds and thousands of new so-called skilled migrants coming into the UK at a time when you're looking at the unemployment figures. There's 1.257 million people unemployed, according to the record, and nearly 1.3 million vacancies in the economy. So surely, should we not be focusing on upskilling the people that are out of work and getting them into those jobs rather than expanding immigration? Because to my mind, unless I've got this completely topsy, immigration is all about filling the opportunities in the economy that you can't get from the indigenous population, right?
In theory, yes, but I think it's probably about something else in reality. But no, what's happened is after Brexit, obviously, we've seen a reduction in the amount of people coming from Europe. And that was the reason a lot of people voted for Brexit, is to reduce immigration. The government have taken that, however, as to mean, oh, well, we've reduced immigration from Europe, we must replace it from somewhere else. Well, that's not what we wanted. We didn't want it replaced from somewhere else. We wanted it to stop from Europe as well as from other places, and be reduced down to a number which is sustainable and manageable and doesn't put enormous stress on, just ordinary people's lives, quality of life, and things like wage suppression, the increasing cost of living, the inability for young people to get on the property ladder due to the pressure on the housing market, and so on and so forth. So we had all of these concerns, and that's why we said, right, okay, let's get it down to a sustainable, manageable level, and then we can start fixing some issues like the housing market.
Well, it strikes. However, the government. Sorry, Ben, carry on.
I was going to say, but however, the government didn't seem to understand that, or they do understand it and they just don't really care what we think.
That's more of a concern to me, because I look at the demography of this, and the United Kingdom as a whole now, 1.61 children per birthing mother, so well below population replacement, and that's been the case for over 20 years. And yet the population has obviously increased through freedom of movement and open borders by, 8 to 10 million over the last 20 years or so. So is the issue really that the government, as you say, just doesn't care and is more interested in making sure that, a bit like some of the countries in the world where, they are way below population replacement, they just want to make sure that they fill the country with enough bodies to be economically active? Or is there a wider issue at play here?
Yeah, this is the problem. It's a circular way of thinking. The reason people aren't having children is because they can't afford to, because they're living in ever more cramped housing. 30 years ago, you could buy a house for X amount of money, which would now, with the same buying power, get you something half the size because of the effect of mass immigration on the market. So people aren't having kids, not because they don't want to have kids, but because they don't have any space. And because the schools are absolutely jammed and, in decline and all the rest of it. There's a number of issues which immigration is a massive contributing factor towards, which are the reason people aren't having as many children. So if you break down the statistics as well, you say 1.6 below replacement, but if you break it down further to types of people, say you take a couple who are white, British, university educated, of a household income of around 120,000 to 150,000.
Okay.
Their rate of reproduction is somewhere like 0.9. So far below that. So if you actually break it down into certain areas, a lot of that that rate of birth is being bulwarked by groups of people like, for example, large Islamic families in the Midlands, for example, who are counted within those statistics because they've been in Britain for however long and they're being born here, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the birth rates, actually, when you break it down to the native British population, people who are well educated and have good jobs, they're not just having below replacement rate, they're having far below replacement rate. They're to the point where within a generation, you're talking about effectively the population being decreased by a large amount.
So by 2050, this theory that white British will be a minority not just in London but across the country becomes a reality.
2066.
2066. I'll give you the 16 years. No, that's helpful. Thank you. Just looking at this Rwanda policy, Benjamin. I mean, it seems to me that the government has once again got itself wrapped up in human rights lawyer red tape, all again at the taxpayer's expense. Is this really just a deflection strategy around the channel crossings to ignore the fact that there is a red carpet for legal open migration? Or do you think it's actually got some legs?
Look, this was one of the concerns I had a couple of years ago when the channel crossings really started to kick off. Do we allow all of the focus around the conversation on migration to be ordered towards this one particular issue of illegal migration and ignore the large scale legal migration, which is also a big problem? It's a difficult one because both are bad. However, I think if you're not dealing with the vast large scale illegal migration first off, then you'll never get a handle on the legal issue either. So you have to sort of run, you can't run before you walk. You have to sort of start with the really bad thing, grip it by the nettles, and deal with the illegal channel crossings. And the other thing as well is, if the government aren't dealing with illegal migration, why would you ever expect them to deal with legal migration either? So it's a good litmus test for the government's intentions. So it's a good way of getting a sense of whether they actually care and putting pressure on them to begin to do some things. So in that sense, you do have to leverage the issue to draw attention to it. But yeah, no, we shouldn't stop talking about legal migration and only focus on the illegal issue. Both are sort of just as important, and yet we can be distracted by the illegal issue because it's so much more palpable and visual and much more very clearly an outrage when you see the dinghies coming in full of these young men in designer clothes who are going to then be supported by the taxpayer for years and never deported or returned to where they came from. So I can understand why people focus on it, but yeah, we should be speaking more about the legal issue, because just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right.
No, indeed, and it makes you wonder actually whether or not we should be trawling the seabed, given the lack of cobalt here, for all of these mobile phones that seem to be discarded within about 5 miles of the shore. In terms of the government's credibility around immigration, I mean, there was much talk about this Australian points-based system. But when you start looking at things like the European Convention of Human Rights and the Human Rights Act in which it's embedded, realistically, and this is something that certainly someone like Nigel Farage, who was obviously the one that brought it to the mainstream media's attention that there were dinghies arriving every day, and they finally, 2 years down the road, caught on to it. Would you agree that until such time as we leave the ECHR and repeal the Human Rights Act and restate in British law, that really all the government is doing is, as you said earlier on, is going around in a circular motion?
Yeah, so this is another thing I've always said. The government now are effectively doing policy by press release. As long as it sounds good and it's got
Correct.
a punchy name, Australian points-based system, that's all that matters. It doesn't actually need to be applied or work. The Rwanda scheme is a perfect example of that. They know that it's not legally viable to send people to Rwanda because of the ECHR, because of the Human Rights Act, because of a number of other laws that exist, loopholes, etc., which are exploited often by these immigration lawyers and human rights lawyers in order to effectively make a mockery of our rule of law and our borders. So they know what these legal changes need that need to be made. They know what they are. Why aren't they making them? Well, because they don't want to, because they don't actually care. All they want to do is let people think that they're dealing with it, because it doesn't matter if they do deal with it or not. All that matters is people think they're doing something. So when the left come out and say Priti Patel is so awful, she's doing all this stuff about immigration that's so cruel and harsh, and she's deporting people. She's not deporting people. No one's getting deported. Of the 30,000 people who came over the channel last year in the dinghies, I think 5 were deported. It was zero up until the end of the year, when she very quickly went, well, we better deport some so it's not 0 anymore, because people kept saying, I kept going on and saying, Germany, 0. And so she went, well, we better get rid of some so they can't say that anymore. In a way, 5 is worse, because it shows they can do it when they want to. They just don't.
Well, I mean, 5 barely moves the needle, but I suppose in terms of optics, 5 is better than 0. No, actually, 5 is terrible. It's actually worse. I agree with you.
I think
it's worse than
0. Because if it was 0, you could say, well, clearly there's some legal barriers and she might be doing her best, but she can't get it done. But it's like she's shown she can do it when she wants to. She doesn't want to.
So what you're saying, if I'm reading the runes correctly here, is this really comes down to political will. We're out of the European Union. We're free to make our own laws. We don't have to remain part of the European Court of Human Rights. I mean, I was having a conversation this morning with a Labour activist on the subject of the ECHR within the Belfast Agreement. And the argument that he propagated was that we couldn't possibly leave the European Court of Human Rights because that would countermand the Belfast Agreement, which is absolute nonsense. I mean, my understanding is that when you look at things like employment law, we're actually much stronger on this than the European Union. And no one is talking here about watering down human rights legislation, but making it fit for purpose for the United Kingdom, which is an island nation.
Yeah. It's precisely what I'd agree with. And the idea that we can't leave, it's the same thing people said about the EU for years. It doesn't hold any water as an argument. Why would we buy how is it that our law would be inextricable from some foreign body? It doesn't make any sense. For years, thousands of years, we were self-governing and self-ruling, and we got along perfectly fine. We've been in the ECHR all of 60, 70 years. At most. It's not the be all and the end all. We can survive without it, and the idea that somehow the whole country would collapse if we didn't have ECHR jurisdiction abrogating all our laws and preventing us from enforcing our borders, that we would collapse as a society, is just farcical, and I completely dismiss that idea.
I'm glad we agree it's an absurdity and an aberration. You talked earlier on about the impact on public services, and I think there's the obvious things that people look at, like housing, which clearly, you know, for some people who have been on waiting lists for years to try and get social housing is a major issue. But when you start looking at things like education and health, is it possible to map just how significant an impact that is having, both in terms of the cost and in terms of the value of the delivery that's being delivered in terms of patient outcomes, for example, in health, and in educational outcomes for children?
So one of the things, I'll start with education, which is a very interesting area. One of the challenges presented is for differentiation. So when you have a number of people coming into the country, young kids who don't really speak the language, going into a classroom with a bunch of other kids, you're putting an enormous amount of pressure on the teacher, who then has to translate all of the documents into, all of the work into other languages, help the kids learn the language. What you're doing is you're preventing the teacher from being able to properly educate the rest of the class. And we're not resourcing these people any, you know, to the degree that we need to counterbalance the damage that is done by that. And when you have the need for differentiation in every school, in every classroom, primarily in comprehensive schools, this is less of an issue in private schools, of course, which again it creates a class issue as well. So if you're a young working class white boy from East London, you're going to get a worse quality of education than you would have done 50 years ago.
Indeed.
You know, just because of the fact that you're going to have a lot of people in your class who require a lot more attention and differentiation, just on that alone. So yeah, the government, it's an area where it's like, look, if you want this vast scale of migration, fine, but accommodate for it. If you can't accommodate for it, you can't afford it, don't do it. And that's what it comes down to. If educational standards are decreasing and people are suffering, students are suffering as a result of that, then you clearly, either you don't care about them, which I don't think they do, or you've got some other reason for doing it which you think is more important. But fundamentally what it comes down to for me is, if you can't afford the cost of mass migration, don't do it.
Yeah, I mean, leaving aside slogans like "Take Back Control," which almost now has a really hollow sort of ring to it, I mean, in what way is this conservatism to have these sort of levels of immigration, which went from, you know, 100,000 a year sort of net migration, which seemed like a relatively manageable figure, obviously morphed through freedom of movement. And now that, having left the European Union, we've now found different parts of the world from which to bring people in. I mean, I don't know about you, but when it comes to places like Hong Kong, Afghanistan, Ukraine, we've always done the heavy lifting. And I think most people understand the difference between quote unquote genuine asylum seekers and those who are pure economic migrants. But, you know, how is this conservatism, Benjamin? Because I'm struggling.
It's not conservatism. There's a great point someone made recently, which is, what have the progressives progressed and what have the conservatives conserved? You know, that ultimately they stand for those principles because they're popular and people respond to them, and therefore people vote for them. But fundamentally, neither side care about progress or conserving anything, because the only thing they care about is maintaining their own power base. And that is it. Boris Johnson doesn't want to be the Prime Minister. He wants to have been the Prime Minister and be able to say he was the Prime Minister. It's all about the power and the status and the position and going down in the history books. But he doesn't actually want to rule. He doesn't actually want to do the job when he's in it. He doesn't actually want to conserve anything or protect anything or build anything. All he cares about is saying, I was here and I was Prime Minister. And it really is egoism and, you know, narcissism that drives these people. They don't have any conservative policies. The progressives don't have any progressive policies. Everything is about them and their individual status. And when you understand that, you'll realize why they're doing nothing about migration, because they just don't care. It's not an issue which is going to change whether or not they're in power, because Labour offer no alternative on migration. So it's not a threat. It's not a case of, oh, you're not going to do it, we're going to vote for Labour, because we know that Labour will just do the same thing or worse. So they tend to focus on issues where Labour are a threat to them. And that's why all of the policy making is effectively, you know, ordered towards keeping Labour out of power, rather than actually dealing with the issues that the country needs dealing with.
Well, it sounds to me from what you said as though conservatism is in a parlous state, likewise social democracy. And fundamentally, you actually use the term rule. And it used to be the case that the right governed and the left ruled. But does that mean now that the Conservative Party has moved its tank so far onto the centre-left's lawn that actually he's looking rightwards at Keir Starmer, even though he doesn't know whether or not a woman can have a penis?
Yeah, I'm not even sure if it's a left or right issue anymore. They're basically the same, aren't they? They're just, because neither of them are in any sense, I think, ideological or have any convictions or beliefs beyond the maintenance of their own power. Their only ideology is power. That's it.
Wow. Well, no wonder that having left the European Union, there is still a sort of chattering class towards the globalist movements, despite the lack of G7 attendance at, for example, the World Economic Forum, a desire to give away control over future pandemic policy to the World Health Organization, which is led by a communist. Okay, just finally, because I'm mindful that the time is against us to a point, what exactly do you see, how do you see this playing out at the next general election, broadly speaking, from what you've said, if I've understood? That this is not an issue that Labour particularly are going to go hard on, because they're certainly not going to oppose more mass immigration. But do you believe that the Tories will simply window dress what they've done? Or do you think there is actually anyone left in the Conservative Party that believes in controlling immigration beyond lip service?
There are plenty of people in the Conservative Party who believe in controlling immigration, but they're just not going to go anywhere. They're not going to be promoted or be successful within the party. You know, it's even the people who I know do care about it but are ambitious stay quiet about it because they want to be promoted. That is the culture that exists within the party. If you see something, don't say anything, ignore it, and otherwise you're not going to go anywhere. That's the toxic culture that exists. Anyone with any principles will be consigned to the backbenches for the rest of their days.
If they get there in the first place and get through the actual selection process of the Conservative Central HQ.
This is why most of the MPs who are actually pretty sound on the issue are from before 2010 selection. So anyone who's been selected since 2010, either if they do care, they're not going to tell you.
What a wonderful sewer we have created in Westminster. Benjamin Loughnane, on that note, thank you so much for your time today. Very much appreciated. And if you're minded to, we'd love to have you back on from time to time to continue this debate, because I think in the run up to the next general election, although it may not be something that Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party care about, they certainly will when the opinion polls tell them that they're going to lose the election, as I believe they will. I think we're heading for the worst of all worlds, which is a minority Labour keep the Tories out coalition government. Anyway, Benjamin, thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated today. That was Benjamin Loughnane, Research Fellow on Immigration at the Bow Group. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this week's show. It's time for that begging bowl again. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to the channel, share the video, and click like. It will make the algorithm folks really happy. On next week's show, I'll be focusing on the future of healthcare provision and discussing the fitness for purpose or otherwise of the NHS. I'll also try to establish what, if anything, can be done to improve such trivial matters as improving patient outcomes and value for taxpayers' money. My panel of stellar guests will include GB News presenter and political commentator Calvin Robinson, Dr. Aseem Malhotra, whose mission is to save lives through evidence-based medicine, and my very own GP and long-suffering good friend, Dr. Peter Campbell. Have a great week, and remember, say what you see while you're still free.